"Get this pauper away from the table," my daughter-in-law said, loud enough for every single person in the room to hear. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the polished oak table I had once picked out myself, back when this house still felt like mine. The chandelier above us cast a warm golden glow, reflecting off crystal glasses and silverware arranged with meticulous care, but none of that warmth reached me. Around the table, conversations stopped mid-sentence, forks hovered in the air, and a silence spread so quickly it felt rehearsed. I could hear the faint hum of the central air, the soft clink of ice settling in someone's drink, and the unmistakable sound of two men in dark suits stepping closer behind me. Security. At a family dinner. For me. I lifted my eyes slowly, not toward the men, but toward my son. Daniel sat across from me, his posture straight, his expression carefully neutral as he stared down at his plate like the pattern in the china suddenly mattered more than anything else in the room. He didn't look at me. Not once. That told me more than anything Ashley could have said. I turned my gaze to her instead. Ashley Collins, perfectly composed in a tailored cream dress, her blonde hair swept neatly over one shoulder, her smile thin and precise like a line drawn with a ruler. She didn't look angry. She didn't look emotional. She looked certain. Certain that I didn't belong here. Certain that no one would challenge her. I let the moment stretch. I let the silence grow heavy enough that people began to shift in their seats. Someone coughed. Someone else pretended to sip their wine. No one spoke. Not to defend me. Not to question her. Not even to break the tension. That was when I noticed the small detail that made everything fall into place. At each setting, there was a printed name card, embossed in gold lettering. I had admired them when I first sat down, thinking how elegant they looked. Now, I leaned slightly to the side and glanced at the one in front of me. It didn't say Margaret Collins. It didn't say anything at all. It was blank. I felt something settle inside me then. Not shock, not even hurt, but clarity. This wasn't an outburst. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision, planned and executed down to the smallest detail. I straightened my back, smoothing my hands against the fabric of my navy dress, the same one I had worn to my husband's retirement party years ago. I remembered how proud Daniel had been that night, how he had stood beside me, introducing me as his mother with a smile that reached his eyes. That memory felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. One of the security men cleared his throat gently, as if unsure how to proceed. I still didn't look at him. Instead, I let my eyes return to Ashley, holding her gaze just long enough to see the flicker of impatience beneath her polished exterior. She wanted me to stand. She wanted me to leave quietly, to disappear without making a scene, to confirm whatever story she had already told the people in this room about who I was and what I meant to this family. I could feel their eyes on me now, measuring, judging, waiting. I took a slow breath, the kind you take when you're about to step into cold water, and finally spoke, my voice calm, steady, and softer than anyone expected. "Are you sure?" I asked, tilting my head just slightly. "That you want me to leave?" I watched the question land between us like something fragile that no one wanted to touch, and for a brief second, Ashley's smile tightened at the corners, just enough to betray that she had not expected me to speak at all, let alone ask something so simple, so direct, and so calm, while the two men behind me shifted their weight, waiting for a signal that did not come as quickly as they had anticipated. Daniel finally looked up then, not at me, but at Ashley, as if searching her face for confirmation of what he was supposed to do next, and that small movement, that hesitation, told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been building without me. How many quiet conversations had taken place behind closed doors where my name had been reduced to a problem that needed solving. I could feel the attention of the entire table settle more heavily now, no longer just curious, but alert, as if they sensed that something had shifted in a way they could not yet define, and I noticed how a woman 2 seats down slowly lowered her glass, her eyes flicking between Ashley and me, unsure of where to place her loyalty in a moment that was no longer as clear as it had been seconds ago. Ashley let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it, and she straightened her posture as if reclaiming control of the room was simply a matter of adjusting her shoulders and lifting her chin. "I think it would be best for everyone," she said, her voice smooth and measured, the the kind of tone people use when they are certain they are being reasonable. If you stepped away, Margaret. This is a formal dinner, and we want to keep things appropriate. Appropriate. I let the word echo quietly in my mind, turning it over as I glanced once more at the empty name card in front of me, the blank space where my name should have been, where my place should have been acknowledged without question, and I realized that this was never about the dinner or the guests, or even the appearance of propriety. This was about erasure. Slow, deliberate, and polite enough to be mistaken for kindness by anyone who did not know where to look. I folded my hands together, resting them lightly in my lap now, and took in the room with a clarity I had not allowed myself before, noticing the details I had overlooked earlier, the way the seating arrangement placed Ashley at the center, the way Daniel had been positioned beside her instead of across from me as he used to be, the way every decision about this evening had been made without me. Even though I had once been the one who hosted, who planned, who made sure every guest felt welcome. Under this roof, one of the security men leaned in slightly, his voice low and careful, as if he did not want to cause a scene but had been instructed to resolve one. "Ma'am," he said, "if you would just come with us." I turned my head just enough to acknowledge him, offering a small, polite nod, the kind you give a stranger who is simply doing his job, and then I looked back at Ashley, holding her gaze a second longer than before, watching as that thin line of a smile began to falter under the weight of something she could not quite control anymore. "You are right about one thing," I said quietly, my voice steady enough that it did not need to rise to be heard. "This is your dinner." I paused, letting that settle, letting the room breathe again, before adding, just as calmly, "But this is still my house." For a moment, no one spoke, and the words seemed to settle over the table in a way that changed the air itself, as if something invisible had just shifted out of alignment and could not be put back the way it was before, and I saw it first in the way the security men hesitated, exchanging a brief glance as though they were suddenly unsure whether they were standing on the right side of the situation, because the authority they had been following a moment ago no longer felt as clear as it had when they first stepped forward. Ashley's expression did not break completely, but it flickered, just enough for me to see the calculation behind her eyes begin to rearrange itself, searching for a way to regain control without losing face in front of the guests who were now watching her more closely than they had before, no longer amused, no longer detached, but quietly attentive in that way people become when they realize they may have misjudged a situation too quickly. Daniel shifted in his chair, the faint scrape of wood against the floor sounding louder than it should have in the silence. And when he finally looked at me, it was not with defiance or anger, but with something far more telling, a kind of uncertainty that had no place in the confident, decisive man he had once been, and I wondered, not for the first time, when that certainty had been replaced, and by whom. "Mom," he said, his voice lower now, careful, as if he were trying to smooth something over without fully committing to either side. "Maybe we can just talk about this later." Later. I almost smiled at the word, not because it was comforting, but because it was familiar, the same quiet deferral that had followed so many small moments over the past few years, moments I had dismissed at the time because they seemed too insignificant to matter. A changed dinner plan, a missed invitation, a conversation that ended just a little too quickly whenever I entered the room. I had told myself those things were coincidences, that families changed, that people grew busy, that I was imagining patterns where none existed, but standing there now, I could see how neatly those small moments had lined up, one after another, forming a path that led directly to this table, to this chair, to this blank card in front of me. I let my gaze move slowly around the room again, noticing how the guests were no longer pretending not to listen, how their attention lingered openly now, how even the ones who did not know me well seemed to sense that what they were witnessing was not simply a disagreement, but something deeper, something that spoke to the structure of this family in ways that could not be easily disguised. "Later has already happened," I said quietly, not looking at Daniel when I spoke, because this was not a conversation meant only for him anymore. "It has been happening for a long time." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that did not need to be explained, and I saw the way Ashley's posture stiffened again, the way her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass, as if she understood, at least in part, that I was no longer responding to the moment she had created, but to something much larger that she had not fully accounted for. One of the guests cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably, and another leaned back in her chair, her expression no longer entertained but thoughtful, as though she were quietly reconsidering everything she had been told about me before tonight. I reached forward then, just slightly, and turned the blank name card so that it faced Ashley instead of me. A small gesture, almost insignificant, but deliberate in its quietness, and I held her gaze as I did it, letting her see that I had noticed, that I understood, that nothing about this evening had been accidental. "You planned this," I said, my voice still calm, still measured, but no longer questioning, because I already knew the answer, every detail. The words did not come out as an accusation, not in the way people usually expect. There was no rise in my voice, no sharp edge meant to provoke a reaction. And that was precisely why they landed the way they did. Because in a room full of polished manners and carefully chosen words, the quiet truth often carried further than anything louder ever could. And I watched as Ashley's composure shifted again, not breaking, not yet, but tightening in a way that suggested she was no longer entirely certain of the ground beneath her. She let out a small breath, placing her glass down with deliberate care, as if the simple act of controlling her movements could restore the balance she felt slipping away. And when she spoke, her tone carried a softness that might have sounded gracious to someone who had not been paying attention from the beginning. "Margaret," she said, her voice smooth, measured, almost patient, "you are misunderstanding the situation. We simply wanted tonight to run smoothly. There are guests here, people who expect a certain level of presentation." I let her words hang there, not interrupting, not correcting, because I had heard variations of that explanation before, not in sentences quite as polished, but in the small decisions that had been made without me, decisions that had always been framed as practical, reasonable, necessary for the sake of something larger than my feelings. I remembered the first time I had noticed it, a holiday dinner 2 years ago, when my usual seat at the head of the table had been quietly reassigned, explained away as a better arrangement for conversation, and I had accepted it then, smiling, telling myself that it did not matter where I sat as long as I was still included. Then there had been the summer trip I had only learned about through photographs posted days after they returned, the captions filled with laughter and sunlight, my absence never mentioned, as if it had been understood by everyone involved that I was not part of that story anymore. And then the smaller things, the conversations that paused when I entered a room, the decisions already made by the time I was informed of them, the subtle shift in tone when Ashley spoke to me. Always polite, always controlled, but never quite warm. Each moment had seemed too minor to confront on its own, too easy to excuse, and I had done exactly that, again and again, until those moments had formed a pattern so complete that it no longer required explanation. I brought my attention back to the present, to the table, to the faces watching us now with a kind of restrained curiosity, and I realized that for the first time, I was not the only one seeing that pattern take shape. "Presentation," I repeated softly, as if testing the word for weight, and then I gave a small nod, acknowledging her choice without agreeing to it. "That is an interesting way to describe it." Daniel shifted again, his hand moving slightly toward his glass before stopping midway, as though even that small action required more certainty than he currently possessed, and I could see the conflict in him now more clearly, the space between what he had allowed and what he was beginning to understand, and it was not anger that filled that space, but hesitation. I did not rush to fill it for him. Instead, I let the silence return, not empty this time, but full of everything that had gone unspoken for far too long, and I sat there, still, composed, allowing them all to sit with it as well, because sometimes the most revealing thing you can do is nothing at all. I let the silence linger just a moment longer, long enough for the room to settle into a kind of uneasy awareness, and then I reached into my handbag with slow, deliberate movements that did not ask for permission or invite interruption, the soft sound of the clasp opening drawing just enough attention to shift every eye back toward me, not out of curiosity now, but anticipation, because something in the rhythm of the evening had changed, and they could feel it even if they could not yet name it. I pulled out a simple envelope, cream-colored, unmarked, the kind of thing that would have gone unnoticed at any other time, and placed it gently on the table beside my empty place card, a aligning it with the edge as if it belonged there all along. Ashley's gaze dropped to it immediately, her composure still intact, but no longer effortless, and I could see the question forming behind her eyes, the calculation adjusting once again, trying to account for a variable she had not planned for. Daniel leaned forward slightly, just enough to signal that he was paying attention now in a way he had not been before, and I noticed how his shoulders tensed, how his hand, which had hovered uncertainly earlier, now rested flat against the table as if grounding himself in something solid. "You are right," I said quietly, my voice steady and even, carrying just far enough without needing to rise. Tonight was planned very carefully. I slid the envelope a few inches forward, not toward Ashley, not toward Daniel, but into the space between us, where it could not be ignored and did not belong to any one person. No one reached for it. That, too, told me everything. I let my fingers rest lightly on its surface for a brief second before withdrawing them, leaving it there as a presence rather than a gesture, and then I looked around the table again, meeting the eyes of a few guests who did not look away this time, their expressions no longer guarded but openly attentive, as if they understood that whatever was inside that envelope mattered in a way that went beyond simple family tension. "It is interesting," I continued, "how plans can look complete when you are only looking at one side of them." Ashley's lips parted slightly, as though she were about to respond, to reclaim the narrative before it shifted any further, but she stopped herself, and that hesitation, that brief pause, was more revealing than any words she might have chosen. One of the security men took a small step back, almost unconsciously, as if distancing himself from something that was no longer within the scope of his responsibility, and the other followed, their presence fading into the background without a single instruction from anyone at the table. I noticed it, but I did not acknowledge it. Instead, I let my attention return to Daniel, holding his gaze now in a way I had not earlier, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a quiet steadiness that asked for recognition without demanding it. "Do you remember," I said, my tone softening just slightly, "when we first bought this house?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, his brow tightening as he searched for the connection, for the reason I would bring up something so distant in a moment like this, and I saw the memory surface slowly in his expression, the image of a younger version of himself standing beside me in an empty living room, sunlight coming through the windows, both of us imagining what it would become. "You said it felt like the beginning of something permanent," I added, letting the words settle gently, not as a reminder meant to wound, but as a truth that had once been shared. I paused then, just long enough for that memory to take shape in the room between us, before finally glancing back at the envelope resting on the table, still untouched, still waiting, its quiet presence now heavier than anything that had been said out loud. "I agreed with you," I said, my voice returning to its calm, even tone, which is why I made sure it was. Daniel's eyes moved slowly from me to the envelope and back again, and I could see the exact moment when something shifted inside him, not understanding yet, but the beginning of it, the quiet realization that whatever he had agreed to, whatever he had allowed, might not be as settled as he believed, and that uncertainty spread through him in a way he could not hide, not anymore. Not in front of a room that was now watching him just as closely as they were watching me. Ashley, on the other hand, did not look at Daniel this time. She kept her focus on the envelope, her posture still controlled but no longer relaxed, her fingers resting lightly against the table as if she were resisting the urge to reach forward, to open it, to confirm whatever possibility had just entered the room and refused to leave. "What is that supposed to mean?" she asked finally, her voice still smooth, still measured, but carrying a sharper edge beneath it now, the first real crack in the certainty she had worn so effortlessly at the beginning of the evening. I did not answer her question directly, not because I did not have one, but because I understood that the power of the moment did not come from explanation, it came from timing, and timing, like everything else that mattered, required patience. Instead, I let my gaze drift once more across the table, noticing how the guests no longer pretended to be detached observers, how their attention had settled fully into the space between us, how even the smallest movements now carried weight because no one wanted to miss what would happen next. "It means," I said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that not everything you assumed was yours ever was." The sentence was simple, almost understated, but it landed with a quiet finality that did not need emphasis. And I saw it in the way Ashley's expression tightened again, in the way Daniel's shoulders stiffened as though he had just felt the ground shift beneath him without warning. One of the guests let out a small breath, not quite a gasp, but enough to break the silence for a fraction of a second before it returned, heavier than before, more focused, more expectant. Ashley straightened slightly, her chin lifting just a fraction as she reached for control again, and when she spoke, her tone carried a practiced calm that would have convinced anyone who had not been paying attention to the details unfolding around her. "Margaret," she said, her voice steady, "if this is about the house, Daniel and I have already taken care of all the legal arrangements. Everything is in order." I let her finish without interruption, allowing the confidence in her words to settle into the room, because it was important that everyone heard them clearly, that everyone understood exactly what she believed to be true before that belief was tested. I then glanced briefly at the envelope, still resting untouched between us, before lifting my eyes back to hers. "I know," I replied quietly, my voice calm, almost gentle. "You signed what you were given." The reaction was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable, a flicker of confusion passing through her expression before she could conceal it, a brief hesitation that told me more than any denial ever could, and beside her, Daniel turned his head slightly, his gaze moving from Ashley to me again, searching now, not just uncertain, but beginning to question. I did not rush the moment. I did not fill the silence. I simply let it expand, let it settle around them, because the truth, when it is placed carefully, does not need to be pushed, it unfolds on its own, one realization at a time, and I had already placed the first piece exactly where it needed to be. I watched the meaning of my words begin to settle in, not all at once, but in small, uneven pieces, like something fragile being assembled too late to be stopped, and I saw it most clearly in Daniel, in the way his expression shifted from uncertainty to something sharper, something more focused, as if he were finally looking at a situation he had only glanced at before, and for the first time that evening, he did not look away from me when our eyes met. Ashley, however, reacted differently, her composure tightening rather than loosening, her posture straightening as though she could hold everything together through force of will alone. And when she finally reached for the envelope, it was not with hesitation, but with a deliberate control that suggested she still believed she could contain whatever was inside. The soft sound of the paper sliding across the table seemed louder than it should have been, drawing every eye to her hands as she opened it with careful precision, unfolding the document inside without rushing, without acknowledging the weight that now rested in the room around her. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply watched. Her eyes scanned the page once, then again, more slowly the second time, and that was when the first real change appeared, not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakable, a slight pause, a fraction of a second where her gaze lingered too long on a line she had not expected to see, and though her face remained composed, the certainty behind it began to thin. Daniel leaned closer, his voice low, almost hesitant, as if he were unsure whether he wanted to know the answer to the question he was about to ask. "Ashley, what is it?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she lowered the paper just enough to glance at him, and in that brief exchange, I saw something pass between them that had not been there before, not confidence, not alignment, but doubt. "It is nothing," she said quickly, too quickly, folding the document with a precision that bordered on urgency, as though reducing it to a smaller shape could somehow reduce its meaning. But the movement only made the tension more visible, more undeniable, and Daniel's expression tightened further as he reached for the paper before she could fully pull it back. "Let me see it," he said, his voice firmer now, no longer asking. And for a moment, Ashley held on to it, her fingers resisting just enough to reveal what she had already tried to hide, before finally letting go. The paper passed between them, and I watched as Daniel unfolded it, his eyes moving across the lines in a way that mirrored Ashley's earlier reaction, quick at first, then slower, more deliberate, as the implications began to take shape. Around us, the room remained silent, but it was no longer the polite silence of a formal dinner. It was something else entirely, something heavier, more focused, as if every person present understood that whatever was written on that page had already begun to change the outcome of the evening. I let a small breath settle in my chest, not relief, not satisfaction, but recognition, because this moment had been inevitable from the second the first quiet decision had been made without me, from the second my name had been left off that card, from the second someone believed I would not notice. "Read it carefully," I said, my voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach them without breaking the stillness. "It is all there." Daniel did not respond right away. He continued reading, his brow tightening, his posture shifting as the understanding deepened, and when he finally looked up, it was not at Ashley, not at the guests, but at me, and in his eyes, for the first time that night, there was no avoidance, no hesitation, only the quiet realization that everything he thought was settled was not. Daniel did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any reaction he could have forced into words, his eyes still fixed on the document, as though the meaning might change if he read it one more time, slower, more carefully, but it did not change, and I could see the exact moment when acceptance replaced confusion, when the pieces aligned into something he could no longer ignore. Ashley leaned slightly toward him, her voice lowered, controlled, but no longer effortless. "Daniel, it is just a draft," she said, her tone measured, as if she were offering him a simple explanation that should have been enough. But it was not the words themselves that mattered. It was the timing, the way they arrived too late, after the doubt had already taken hold. He did not look at her when she spoke. Instead, he lifted his eyes back to me, holding my gaze in a way he had avoided all evening. And there was something different there now, something steadier, something that suggested he was finally willing to see what had been in front of him for longer than he wanted to admit. "You never transferred anything," he said slowly, the realization forming as he spoke it out loud, not as a question, but as a statement that confirmed itself the moment it was heard. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not triumphant, not defensive, simply acknowledging the truth as it stood. "I made arrangements," I replied quietly, my voice even, "to ensure that what your father and I built would remain protected." Ashley straightened in her seat, the last trace of her earlier ease now gone, replaced by something sharper, more urgent, though she still held her composure well enough that only someone watching closely would notice the shift. "Protected from what?" she asked, her tone carrying a thin edge beneath the calm, and for the first time, there was something in her voice that sounded less like control and more like concern. I let the question settle, not because I needed time to answer, but because the answer itself was already unfolding in the room around us, in the way the guests were now watching without disguise, in the way Daniel's posture had changed, in the way the balance that had once favored her so completely was no longer stable. "From assumptions," I said at last, my words quiet but precise, "from decisions made too quickly, and from people who believe that access is the same as ownership." The room remained still, but it was not the same stillness as before. It was no longer passive, no longer waiting. It was engaged now, aware, as if everyone present understood that they were witnessing a shift that could not be reversed. One of the guests leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful, no longer aligned with the quiet judgments that had filled the room earlier, and another glanced toward Daniel, as though waiting to see how he would respond now that the foundation beneath him had changed. He lowered the document slowly, placing it back on the table with a care that matched the gravity of what it contained, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was steadier, more deliberate than it had been all evening. "Ashley," he said, turning toward her now, "why did you say everything was already settled?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight that could not be dismissed, and for the first time, Ashley did not answer immediately, her silence no longer controlled, but searching, as though she were recalculating a situation that no longer followed the plan she had relied on. I watched them both for a moment, then slowly rose from my seat, smoothing the fabric of my dress with the same calm precision I had carried from the beginning, and I noticed how the security men stepped further back without being asked, how the space around me opened without resistance, not because I demanded it, but because it was no longer mine to fight for. I did not reach for the envelope. I did not take anything with me. I simply looked once more at the table, at the arrangement, at the empty card that had started it all, and then I turned slightly, my voice soft but clear enough to carry across the room. "You invited me here as if I were a guest," I said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "But you forgot who made this place a home." I did not wait for a response, because there was nothing left in that room that required one. Not from them, not from me. And as I stepped away from the table, I could feel the shift behind me without turning around. The kind of shift that happens when certainty dissolves and leaves people standing in a version of reality they had not prepared for. And I knew that if I looked back, I would see it clearly in their faces, in the way Daniel would still be holding that document, as if it might anchor him to something stable, in the way Ashley would be searching for a way to regain control that no longer existed in the same form it had just minutes ago. The sound of my heels against the hardwood floor was soft but steady, each step measured, unhurried, not an escape, not a retreat, but a choice, and I noticed how no one moved to stop me, how the space opened naturally as I passed, how even the guests who had watched in silence now lowered their eyes or shifted in their seats, not out of dismissal, but something closer to recognition, as if they understood, at least in part, what had just taken place. I reached the edge of the dining room and paused briefly, not because I needed to, but because there was one last thing that belonged to me in that moment. Not the house, not the table, not even the history that had been quietly rewritten without my consent, but the truth that had finally been placed where it could not be ignored. Behind me, I heard Daniel's voice, quieter than before, no longer controlled, no longer certain. "Mom, wait." The word lingered in the air, uncertain, unfamiliar in the way it was spoken now, as if he were trying to reach something that had already moved beyond where he last left it. I did not turn immediately. I let the silence stretch just enough for him to feel it, for him to understand that this was not a moment that could be undone with a single word or a delayed realization. When I finally looked back, it was not at the table, not at the guests, but at him, standing halfway between where he had been sitting and where I now stood, the document still in his hand, his posture no longer aligned with anyone but himself. Ashley remained seated, her expression composed but distant, as though she were already retreating into a calculation that would take time to rebuild, her earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something more cautious. I held Daniel's gaze for a moment, long enough to acknowledge what had changed, not just in the room, but in him, and then I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not forgiveness, not rejection, simply recognition. "Some things," I said softly, my voice carrying just far enough to reach him without inviting the rest of the room back into the moment, "are clearer when you stop trying to control them." He did not answer, and he did not need to, because the understanding was already there, unfinished but present, and I turned again, continuing toward the front of the house with the same steady pace, leaving behind the table, the empty card, and the version of myself they had tried to define. The door opened quietly, the cool evening air meeting me as I stepped outside, and for the first time that night, the silence felt different, not heavy, not waiting, but complete, and as I walked down the path I had once helped design, I realized that nothing had been taken from me that I had not already chosen to leave behind, and that what remained was not loss, but something far more certain, something no one in that room had understood until it was too late, that I had never been a guest in that house, not for a single day, and I never would be.